Excellent, folks. It's great to see you again. Here we are in U.S. history, and we're talking about the Cold War. This is Lesson 9, Part A. We'll have a Part B that really talks about the second half of this particular lesson. But I want to let you know that there's a lot of information on these slides, and so as we go, it would be great for you to pause, make sure you read all the bullet points on the slides, as well as listen to my narrative as we go. So really, right now, we're going to be talking about something called the Cold War. The Cold War was what happened as the world realigned itself after World War II. Of course, Europe was in shambles during World War II, so was Asia. And out of World War II, the idea of superpowers grew. And we had a superpower and its allies focused on the United States, and a superpower and its allies focused on Russia, or the Soviet Union. And even though those two nations had been allies during World War II, they became enemies during the Cold War. So let's take a look and see how that happened. Well, like we talked about, obviously the Soviets and the U.S. were the two major factors at the end fighting Germany, the Soviets on the east and the U.S. on the west, and they met in April of 1945 and celebrated and congratulated each other for helping to rid the world of the Nazi menace, and there was a lot of optimism for what was going to happen in the future with the relationship between these two countries. However, very quickly, within only a couple of years, these two countries were set apart as enemies. Now, they weren't fighting a war, a hot war, where they were shooting bullets at each other, but they certainly were fighting a Cold War, and we'll talk about what that is. Part of that happened because of the differing views of the war, of the world after World War II. In World War II, the American deaths were 400,000, which is a significant number. That's a huge number of people. That's about 1 out of every maybe 4 people in Las Vegas, to give you an idea. That's a large number of people to die, there's no question. However, the Soviet death toll, including civilians who died during World War II, was closer to 20 million. So there's a huge disconnect between how much World War II damaged the individual countries. In the Soviet Union, there were about 25 million citizens left homeless. So in addition to 20 million human beings killed, 25 million didn't have a home. And after World War II, the American economy was booming because it was the only place in the world, really, the only industrialized nation that hadn't been destroyed. So it was really rolling along, whereas the Soviets were trying to just rebuild their country. So there became this uneasy alliance, and certainly that had to do a little bit with the people that were in charge of the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So they had a common goal, which was to defeat Hitler, but as soon as that left, they kind of broke apart because they were very different countries, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Soviet Union leader Stalin felt that the Allies delayed attacking the European mainland, and that led to the loss of many Soviet lives. So he was upset and frustrated that the Western powers didn't do as much as they could to protect his people. And we also saw a lot of fears and misunderstandings left over from World War I related to the Soviet Union versus the West. So that started to lead to some problems as well. At the conclusion of World War II, or right at the end, it really hadn't gotten to an armistice yet, but it was obvious that Germany was going to lose. The major powers in the West met at a place called Yalta to have a conference about what the end of the war and the post-World War II world was going to look like. So this was Roosevelt representing the United States, Churchill representing England, and Stalin representing the Soviet Union. And really this was a meeting that was going to set the stage for what would happen afterwards. And in the conference, they agreed to some of the following things, and you can kind of look at the map here and see what I'm talking about. First is that the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan as soon as Germany surrendered. Up until that point, the Soviet Union had not been fighting Japan. That had really only been the United States and Britain. That was one agreement. Also, that Germany would be divided into several zones, and each major power on the West, or in the Allies, would have control over that zone of Germany. And then also, Stalin, who had been his armies marching from the west through Eastern Europe, or from the east through Eastern Europe, demanded control over Eastern Europe. So places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, some of those nations, he wanted to have post-war control over. And he essentially got that during Yalta. Very soon after Yalta and right before the end of World War II, FDR dies. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had served 3 full terms and a little bit of a 4th term, the longest serving president in American history, and he dies in April of 1945. So his vice president, Harry Truman, is sworn in during those last few days of World War II. And he really was unprepared. He'd been kind of left in the dark by FDR on a lot of major issues. Some of the things like Yalta, things like the atomic weapons that were going to be dropped on Japan. He didn't know anything about those. And he has to jump in with both feet very quickly and get himself up to speed. Another thing, and we alluded to this in the last lesson, is that after the war ends, there's a desire never to allow this to occur again. Now, certainly they'd had that discussion at the end of World War I and started something called the League of Nations, but it didn't work very well. And so there was another design, an effort to try to get something together, some sort of a unified world body that would help protect from having these kind of massive battles fighting worldwide. And this idea comes out of Yalta. And the United Nations really is designed to work to maintain international peace and security and be a forum to discuss issues of concern. Really, the U.S. hopes that the United Nations will work towards self-determination, which means that it will be able to help little nations interact with bigger nations. And the UN Charter is ratified in October of 1945, and it still is with us today. It's focused in New York, and every nation of the world is represented. At the conclusion of World War II, and once the Yalta Conference is ended, there's a meeting again of the big three, again Churchill, this time Truman, and Stalin, at Potsdam, which is in the former German-controlled areas. And Truman is essentially advised by his close associates to try to contain the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union, which has grown a little bit bigger by kind of controlling that Eastern European piece we talked about, the thought is that we shouldn't allow it to get any bigger, that the Soviet Union itself, or any countries that are similar to it, communist nations, should be looked at as a threat and should be controlled. And so that becomes kind of the Western, and certainly the United States, philosophy of foreign nations from this point on out. And the U.S., to that end, provides military and economic aid very soon after World War II to Greece and Turkey to try to contain the Soviet Union and its satellite nations in that part of the world. At the same time, we have to do something about Europe. Europe is absolutely in shambles, and certainly Germany has been destroyed, most of it by the United States and the Soviet Union bombing it in order to try to win World War II. But we recognize that in order for Western Europe to be an important factor, and certainly to be equal to what the Soviets are doing in Eastern Europe, we have to rebuild it. And so the United States comes up with something called the Marshall Plan, which really is to help rebuild the European economy, both militarily and in terms of civilian things like providing food aid and rebuilding the industrial centers and things of that sort. It's named for a former general and the Secretary of State, George Marshall, and ultimately $17 billion are given by the United States to help European nations rebuild. And certainly Truman hopes that not only will Europe rebuild itself, but also those Western European nations will look at the United States favorably. You know, here we gave you all this money and we helped you rebuild. That's a positive thing. So that's a little bit about what was happening right after World War II. We'll go into a little bit more detail about the Cold War in Part B, so take a look at that when you have a minute.